All right, for this week's sprint, the almost final sprint, we've got some stuff updated here. As you'll see, we've got over on the left here, we've got ourselves an image manager so that loading in images is going to be easier for the player. We've also got default assets loading in here. Nice long name to prevent, the user accidentally overwriting them for any reason. The bounding sphere and the color constant renderer are already used in that's for the visualizer. The sprite model and sprite render shader are necessary for doing sprites, obviously, so they're also default assets. The image manager here takes in the key for whatever image you're going to add, the texture key, and the sub-rectangle from that texture. So this you need to have textures loaded in first before you load in your images, but I think that's pretty self-explanatory here. Get image obviously works like all the other managers. It returns the image back into it. The code in here is pretty standard, just based on the other asset managers. And I do make sure I'm deleting it. I'm updated to 1.5, so that's no problem. The next thing down here, you'll see the drawable system has been split into two. We've got image draw manager for drawable 2D objects, model draw manager for drawable 3D objects. Differences are negligible between the two. For drawable 3D, it's essentially the old drawable just gets the draw call into 3D. Drawable 2D the same way, essentially comes in as a draw 2D. The difference between the two of them is that in the scene, let me pull this up real quick here. In the scene during the draw phase, I've split that also into draw 2D, draw 3D. And then in the, is it split in the scene manager? No, in the into the engine codes draw here, we need to have the draw 3D done first, then the visualizer, then the 2D draw, so that the visualizer um, bounding spheres don't get messed up by the, the sprite drawing. So that's taken care of. Let's look at the custom class I've made for sprites in and of themselves. So the constructor only needs to take in the basic image, since it's already got a bounding, or not a bounding, but a sub rectangle in it. When we create the graphics object, we can just pass it straight through. We want the image rectangle here. I for the moment, have set scale, get scale, set rotation, set translation, and then I save those as different variables in here. Obviously, the image is the image that we're using, the sprite uh, then being the sprite that, you goes through here. This is probably wrong. I don't think I have the images passed in. I don't want to delete that. So when the user decides that they want to set the scale, it changes the float. And then when the user wants to render, that's when I create these matrices here, create the world matrix, and render it. This is through the scene manager's orthographic camera here, which is set up as you showed us in the PowerPoint presentation. This definition gets a little long because I have to go through the engine code to get the window width, height, etc. But it's not too bad. So that makes it really easy for the user here to deal with sprites. So I've got my textured frigate, so the player's frigate here has a list of sprites. That list of sprites is added to every time the player scores, which is shooting one of the demo boxes that are floating around. Um, the translation, scale, and rotation are all set in here to test those. And sprite is added then in the player's 2D draw here. For each sprite, render the sprite. So if we go into game here, oh yeah, I changed that. So if we go into game here, that looks as normal. This looks the same, but when we shoot boxes, we get sprites coming up on the screen. And obviously the camera's set up correctly so they don't wonk out if we're moving the camera everywhere. And as you can see, the rotation does take effect over time. Each score increases the rotation a little bit. And also I did some clever math so that it eventually will cover the whole screen. How fancy. The other things I've done for this sprint are added a little bit more to the documentation. So I've got a very basic at the moment doxy header here that I'll be adding more pages to describe the various demonstrations that I'm going to build. But I also have here, so here's that welcome page, very simple, but I've got groups created. So right now I've just got the game object group that tells you the different kinds of, the different flavors of game object, so to say, and the various inherited methods from each of those game objects. So if I'm interested in collisions here, uh, inherited from collidable, so I can click on that, move to that class. I get the functions that are directly part of a game object from there, and basic description of them here. I can obviously click on collidable to learn a little bit more about it. This is going to get a little more fleshed out as I move through this week and maybe over spring break. Also depends on other classes, but it's a lot more than it was last week, and I've gotten a handle on how exactly to work this doxygen thing. So group definitions, adding different methods to the group, things like that. But I think that's about it for this week's sprint.